In August 1957, a modest man in traditional Malay dress stood before 500,000 people in Kuala Lumpur and declared something impossible. Malaysia was free, not through violence, not through decades of guerrilla warfare, but through negotiation, patience, and one man's unshakable belief that different races could build a nation together. His name was Tunku Abdul Rahman, and what he did next would either create Southeast Asia's most successful multicultural nation or tear it apart in civil war. This is how he freed Malaysia and built a nation from scratch. Tunku wasn't supposed to be a leader. He was the seventh son of a sultan, which in royal hierarchy means you're basically furniture. While his brothers prepared for thrones and political power, Tunku was sent to study law in England, where he spent more time playing football and enjoying life than actually studying. He failed his law exams twice. This lazy prince who loved parties and sports somehow became the founding father of an entire nation. How does that happen? The answer lies in what the British didn't see coming. When Tunku returned to Malaya in 1941, the Japanese invaded. For 3 years, he watched his country suffer under brutal occupation. The experience changed him completely. The fun-loving prince saw his people starving, watched the different races turn on each other, witnessed the collapse of everything he knew. When the British returned in 1945, Tunku realized something crucial. The colonial masters were exhausted. Britain was broke from World War II, and Malaya's moment had arrived. But here's where Tunku was different from other independence leaders. He didn't pick up weapons. He didn't organize strikes or violent resistance. Instead, he joined a political party called UMNO in 1945 and started talking. Just talking. Meeting people. Listening to complaints. Building relationships. His rivals mocked him. They called him weak. They said negotiation with the British was betrayal. Tunku kept talking. By 1951, he became UMNO's president, and here's where his strategy became clear. Malaya wasn't like India or Indonesia. It didn't have one dominant ethnic group that could simply outvote everyone else. Malays made up about 50% of the population. Chinese were nearly 40%. Indians were around 10%. Any attempt at independence that ignored this reality would end in bloodshed. Tunku understood this in his bones. So he did something radical. In 1952, he formed the Alliance Party, a coalition between UMNO, the Malaysian Chinese Association, and the Malaysian Indian Congress. Think about how insane this was. These communities barely trusted each other. They lived in separate neighborhoods, spoke different languages, practiced different religions. The communist insurgency was literally trying to start a race war in the jungles. And Tunku said, "Let's build a political party together." The British laughed at him. They thought the alliance would collapse in weeks. Instead, it won a shocking victory in the 1952 Kuala Lumpur municipal elections. Then, in 1955, the alliance won 51 out of 52 seats in the Federal Legislative Council elections. Suddenly, the British weren't laughing anymore. They were looking at a unified Malayan front demanding independence, and they had no good reason to refuse. Tunku led a delegation to London in 1956. The negotiations could have dragged on for years. Other colonies spent decades fighting for freedom. Tunku's team secured independence in principle within weeks. The British agreed that Malaya would become independent on August 31, 1957. less than a year away. Why so fast? Because Tunku didn't walk in making demands. He walked in with solutions. He showed the British that Malaya had a functioning multiracial government ready to take over. He promised to protect British economic interests. He agreed to keep Malaya in the Commonwealth. He made independence feel safe and inevitable rather than threatening. But winning independence was only the beginning of the challenge. Now Tunku had to actually build a nation from communities that had little in common except geography. The Malay Peninsula had never been a unified country. It was a collection of sultanates, British territories, Chinese tin mining towns, and Indian rubber plantations. How do you create national identity from that? Tunku's answer was the Constitution of 1957, and this document is a masterpiece of compromise that still defines Malaysia today. To the Malays, he gave official status for Islam as the national religion and Malay as the national language. He enshrined the special position of Malays and indigenous people, giving them advantages in education, business licenses, and government contracts. He protected the sovereignty of the Malay sultans. This wasn't racism. This was recognition that Malays feared being economically dominated in their own homeland. To the Chinese and Indians, he guaranteed citizenship rights, religious freedom, and the right to vernacular education. Chinese schools could teach in Mandarin. Indian schools could teach in Tamil. Places of worship for all religions would be protected. Most importantly, he created a secular legal system for everything except Muslim personal law. You could be Chinese, speak Mandarin, worship Buddha, send your kids to Chinese school, and still be fully Malaysian. Critics on both sides hated it. Malay nationalists said he gave away too much. Chinese leaders said he didn't give enough. Tunku held the center. He kept repeating the same message over and over. We either compromise and build this together, or we fight and destroy everything. There is no third option. The early years tested this vision immediately. The country was desperately poor. Annual per capita income in 1957 was around 1,000 Malaysian dollars, which today would be maybe $300. About 70% of the population lived in rural areas. Infrastructure was minimal outside major cities. Most people were subsistence farmers or plantation workers. The economy depended almost entirely on tin and rubber exports, which meant global price swings could devastate the nation overnight. Tunku focused on three immediate priorities. First, crush the communist insurgency that had been terrorizing the countryside since 1948. Second, diversify the economy beyond tin and rubber. Third, expand education to create a skilled workforce. Simple goals, brutally hard execution. The communist emergency ended officially in 1960, though scattered fighting continued for years. Tunku succeeded partly through military operations, but mostly through winning hearts and minds. He offered amnesty to insurgents who surrendered. He poured money into rural development, so villagers didn't see communists as their only hope. He positioned Malaysia as anti-communist in the Cold War, which brought aid from America and Britain. It worked. The insurgency never disappeared completely, but it stopped threatening the nation's survival. Economic diversification started slowly. Tunku's government created the Federal Land Development Authority in 1956, which opened up jungle land for farming and gave poor Malays their own plots. This resettled thousands of families and reduced rural poverty while increasing agricultural output. Not glamorous, but it worked. The government also started investing in palm oil, which would eventually make Malaysia one of the world's largest producers. In 1957, palm oil was a tiny part of the economy. By the 1970s, it would rival rubber and tin. Education expansion was dramatic. In 1957, primary school enrollment was around 60% of children. The government built thousands of new schools, trained teachers, and made primary education free and eventually compulsory. By 1970, enrollment hit 90%. Secondary education expanded even faster. The University of Malaya, which had only a few hundred students at independence, grew into a major institution. Technical colleges opened across the country. Tunku understood that without education, Malaysia would stay poor forever. But Tunku's biggest challenge wasn't economics. It was keeping the racial peace. In 1959, elections produced growing tensions as opposition parties started playing racial politics. Some Malay parties said the alliance gave too much to the Chinese. Some Chinese parties said Malays received unfair privileges. Tunku responded by doubling down on moderation. He expelled extremists from UMNO. He publicly celebrated Chinese New Year and Deepavali. He appointed capable ministers regardless of race. He kept preaching his message of unity. Then came Singapore. In 1963, Tunku proposed forming Malaysia, which would merge Malaya with Singapore, Sarawak, Sabah, and briefly Brunei. The logic was solid. Singapore was majority Chinese and economically powerful, but militarily vulnerable. Sarawak and Sabah added territory and resources. Together, they'd create a stronger, larger nation. Britain supported it. Most local leaders supported it. Indonesia and the Philippines opposed it, claiming Malaysia was a neo-colonial conspiracy. But Tunku pushed ahead. Malaysia was proclaimed on September 16, 1963. Almost immediately, things went wrong. Lee Kuan Yew, Singapore's leader, started pushing for a Malaysian Malaysia that would reduce Malays' special rights. This terrified Malays, who saw it as Chinese dominance. Racial tensions exploded. Riots broke out. The alliance's careful balance started cracking. Indonesia launched armed confrontation, sending soldiers across the border. The Philippines challenged Malaysia's claim to Sabah. Internally, Singapore and Kuala Lumpur were basically at war politically. Tunku faced an impossible choice: keep Singapore in Malaysia and risk civil war between Malays and Chinese, or expel Singapore and admit that his multiracial vision couldn't hold together. In August 1965, Tunku chose separation. Singapore became independent. He announced it in a press conference where he visibly cried. This wasn't a triumph. This was failure. His dream of uniting all these territories and peoples had broken. But here's what most people miss. Tunku's decision to let Singapore go probably saved Malaysia. By 1965, racial tensions were at the breaking point. Lee Kuan Yew's Malaysian Malaysia rhetoric was radicalizing Malays. Chinese were feeling increasingly defensive. Violence was inevitable. By separating, Tunku relieved the pressure. Malaysia's Chinese population dropped from about 40% to about 35%, making Malays clearly the majority. This reduced Malay anxiety. Singapore got to pursue its own vision. Both nations survived. The late 1960s brought relative stability. The economy grew steadily at around 6 to 7% annually. Living standards improved. Infrastructure expanded. The alliance kept winning elections comfortably. Tunku seemed secure. Malaysia seemed to be working. Then came May 13th, 1969. The 1969 election results shocked everyone. The alliance lost its two-thirds majority in parliament. Opposition parties, particularly those appealing to Malay and Chinese nationalism, made huge gains. Victory celebrations by opposition supporters in Kuala Lumpur were seen by many Malays as provocative. On May 13th, racial riots exploded across the capital. For 2 days, Malays and Chinese killed each other in the streets. Official death toll was nearly 200. Real number was probably much higher. Thousands injured. Property destroyed. The nation's multiracial experiment seemed finished. Tunku declared a state of emergency. Parliament was suspended. A National Operations Council took over. For months, Malaysia existed in limbo. Tunku was devastated. Everything he'd built seemed to be collapsing. This wasn't supposed to happen. He'd created the alliance precisely to prevent this. But racial politics had overwhelmed moderation. The violence proved that Malaysia's unity was fragile, held together more by Tunku's personal authority than by genuine integration. In September 1970, Tunku resigned as Prime Minister. He was 67 years old and exhausted. His deputy, Tunku Abdul Rahman, took over and immediately pursued different policies. Razak launched the new economic policy, which dramatically expanded Malay privileges to reduce the economic gap between races. He broadened the alliance into the Barisan National Coalition, adding more parties. He took harder stances on Malay rights and national language policy. The era of Tunku's gentle compromise was over. So, did Tunku fail? Looking at 1970, you could argue, yes. The race riots seemed to prove his approach didn't work. Singapore's separation suggested multiracial federation was impossible. The need for his successor to adopt more aggressive pro-Malay policies indicated the compromise constitution wasn't sustainable. Tunku left office not in triumph, but in tragedy. But here's the longer view. Tunku gave Malaysia 12 years of relative peace during the most dangerous period in its history. From 1957 to 1969, while other new nations collapsed into coups, civil wars, and dictatorships, Malaysia held elections, grew its economy, built institutions, and avoided catastrophe except for that one horrible outbreak. Those 12 years allowed Malaysia to develop the foundation for everything that came after. More importantly, Tunku established principles that Malaysia never abandoned even when it moved away from his specific policies. The constitution remained. The alliance structure evolved but continued. Islam stayed the official religion, but religious freedom continued. Vernacular education survived. The multiracial coalition as the basis of government became permanent. Even the new economic policy, which Tunku might have opposed, was justified as necessary to fulfill the constitutional promise of improving Malay welfare. Everything still referenced back to the framework he created. Tunku lived until 1990, dying at age 87. He spent his retirement writing columns, giving speeches, and gently criticizing the government when he thought it strayed from multiracial principles. He watched Malaysia become the Asian tiger economy he'd hoped for. He saw living standards increase more than 10 times over. He witnessed Malaysia become a respected middle power. None of that was guaranteed in 1957, when he stood before that crowd and declared independence. Today, Malaysia is far from perfect. Racial tensions still flare up. Corruption is a massive problem. Political coalitions keep fracturing. The Barisan Nasional that dominated for decades finally lost power in 2018. But Malaysia is still here, still multiracial, still democratic, with regular elections, still managing to keep Malays, Chinese, Indians, and dozens of indigenous groups living together without civil war. In a region that experienced the Cambodian genocide, the Indonesian massacres, and the Myanmar ethnic cleansings, Malaysia's survival as a multiracial democracy is extraordinary. That's Tunku Abdul Rahman's legacy. Not perfection, not paradise, just survival and the possibility of something better. He took a collection of sultanates, colonial territories, and immigrant communities that had no reason to coexist and convinced them to try. He negotiated independence without firing a shot. He wrote a constitution that balanced irreconcilable demands. He held together a nation that should have torn itself apart. When it finally did crack, in 1969, the foundation he built was strong enough that Malaysia survived and rebuilt. The lazy prince, who failed his law exams twice, freed Malaysia and built a nation from scratch. Not through brilliance or force, but through patience, compromise, and unshakable faith that different people could choose to live together. History will debate whether his approach was too soft, whether he should have done more to integrate the races, whether the special privileges he granted created more problems than they solved. But nobody can debate this. When Tunku Abdul Rahman declared independence in 1957, Malaysia had every reason to fail. That it didn't is because of him.